Good morning, St. Paul's. I'm Pastor Anna, and I mean it when I say that I am so happy to be with you here today on the third week of our Living the Question series. I'm one of your two new pastors, and in the short month that I've been here, I have been blessed with the opportunity to start getting to know some of you. I'd love to hear about your passions and your gifts, and especially your stories that you share with me. I am an avid collector of stories. And now I'm excited because I get the chance to tell you a little bit of mine. So as some of you know, I grew up in Florida. Yes, I do know that it gets rather cold here, and yes, I do know that I have seen snow before. Florida is an interesting place, to say the least. It is definitely not all orange groves or beaches or Mickey Mouse. The Sunshine State, as we call it, is also famous for bizarre news stories. If you want to go on a wild ride, Google Florida man. Trust me. They're famous for hurricanes and bad drivers, and of course, the rather exotic wildlife. We've got alligators, big old alligators, panthers, way too many insects, including cockroaches the size of my hand, big fat iguanas that lays on the tree branches and eat your plants in your gardens, loud, crazy birds, every color of the rainbow. My husband calls Florida Swamp Narnia. You learn a lot about nature when you grow up in Florida. Field trips to zoos and wildlife preserves and airboat rides in the swamps are just par for the course for Florida kids. I remember being 5 years old and my teacher showing us all how to walk in zigzags to confuse alligators if we were ever unfortunate enough to encounter a hungry one. We chased away those bright green iguanas with palm fronds so they would stop eating our plants. I had a pet peacock in junior high. It's a long, long story. Being a kid in Florida, I imagine it was like living in a very weird episode of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Because Florida kids learn so much about wildlife, they also learn a lot about wildlife conservation. I've heard so many sad stories about irresponsible boaters hitting and killing sweet, innocent manatees. I came home crying in second grade because I heard about how many animals die from the plastic rings on packs of soda cans. I demanded that my parents start cutting them before they threw them out. This is a habit that I have carried with me to this day. We were quizzed on statistics about water pollution and endangered species in our science classes. Now, growing up, learning how to walk in zigzags and crying over plastic might sound humorous to some of you, but I think it gave us an appreciation for nature and a sense of responsibility to care for it. And I've carried this into adulthood. Not to pat myself on the back or anything, but theologically speaking, this perspective is a very good one. And here's why. Our passage for today is likely very familiar to a lot of you. It's the first story in our biblical canon, and it's one of two Bible stories about how the world came to be, and a story about the God who spoke it into existence. If you want to learn a little more about the second story, you can join me at 12:30 in the library for the Director's Cut class. Shameless plug, but I'd love to see you there. In the beginning, the text says, God created the heavens and the earth. God hovers over a formless void and does what God does best. Creates meaning and order from chaos and confusion and darkness. First comes the light, then night and day. God hangs the stars and the sun in the sky. The seas and the skies separate. The land grows lush and green. All kinds of creatures fill the oceans and the earth. They trod and they crawl and they swim and they fly. And then, in God's own image, God makes humankind. It's a story that we've squabbled about, possibly more than any other in our tradition. As we grow in knowledge, we struggle to reconcile the accounts in the Bible with what we now know to be scientifically true. Regardless of how factual the account is or is not, I believe that the core remains the same. God made the world, God made everything in it, God made us in God's image, and God called all of it very good. piece that is often lost in the shuffle is the special mission that God gives humankind. As humanity comes to be, God says, let them have dominion over the fish and the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals on earth, over every creeping thing upon the earth. We're giving plants for foods, creatures to live alongside. We're called to live into our special place in the world, to enjoy the earth and its beauty and to protect it, to be good stewards of this gift. Unfortunately, as we humans often do, we took this to an extreme. We seized the resources so generously given to us, the plants and the animals and the land and the air and the sea, and we've used them without any sense of moderation. We have ravaged forests. We've polluted our oceans and the air. We have rendered this earth inhospitable to an untold number of plant and animal species, causing them to go extinct. Global warming, which is the name given to the steady rise in the Earth's temperature due in large part to human activity, looms, and it threatens us with total ruin, particularly for those on Earth who are the most vulnerable. Christians have interpreted dominion to mean entitlement. Worse, many Christians hold to a theology that fails to consider the gravity of the situation. Popular belief assures Christ's followers that our planet is of little consequence. Jesus will return someday and take the faithful to a new heaven and a new earth. And so Christians who care about the environment are labeled as faithless and out of touch with the will of God. Get this, relatively recently I saw a bumper sticker reading something to the effect of, "Global warming, bring it on, let's see the world on fire for God." So is this an authentically Christian interpretation of our relationship with the world? Maybe it's the Floridian tree hugger in me talking, but I would argue that no, it is not. If we believe that God created the heavens and the earth and called it good, if we believe that we were given this earth as a precious gift to be stewards of, we must believe that protecting creation is part of our call as Christ followers. Of this failure to live into our calling, theologian and author Megan McKenna writes, "Never once are we asking, are we insulting the God of creation by the way we live and what we do? That is spitting in the face of God." In a letter addressing the problem of climate change, Pope Francis asserts that living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or secondary aspect of Christian experience. Luckily, the tide appears to be turning. People, Christians and non-Christians alike, are waking up. I have already spoken to many of you who are so passionate about climate justice and who love and appreciate creation. I have to think that living in a place as beautiful as Montana will do that to you. There is a lot to love and a lot to protect, and this gives me so much hope. We are blessed with the gift of intellect and scientific inquiry, and it brings us a lot of helpful information about what we can do to work towards positive change. And I'm certain that you know some of them. Name a couple out loud. Recycling. Pick up trash. Reuse. Stop using pesticides. Cut down on our use of plastic. Repurpose. Excellent. These are all great things that most of us can do to take care of the earth. But you may notice that I said most of us. Things are always more complicated than they seem at first glance. Caring for creation requires a big picture approach and a healthy dose of realism, I'm afraid. For instance, many cities are banning the use of plastic straws in restaurants to cut down the amount of plastic we use, because a whopping 91% of it ends up in landfills and oceans. But some people with disabilities rely on plastic straws to do things we take for granted. And while there are many plastic alternatives that are coming up, they prove dangerous or unhelpful for many reasons. Going vegetarian or vegan reportedly helps the environment, but our low-income and unhoused neighbors often do not have the luxury of having dietary restrictions. Lecturing folks who don't know when their next meal is coming, let alone what it's going to be about reducing their carbon footprint, isn't going to do much good, I don't think. I'll admit that I used to find hunting completely barbaric. But moving to the West has opened my eyes to how many people rely on hunting to survive. And while all of these lifestyle changes available to us are good, admirable things, they can seem like small drops in a very large bucket when global corporations do much more to harm our wildlife, water, and air quality with their wasteful practices than we do by using plastic or failing to recycle or eating meat. Please, I beg you, do not misunderstand me. These are admirable pursuits for those who are able, pursuits that I myself participate in. But I do think it's important to be practical and important to remember that the members of our human family are part of creation. It is just as unethical to make broad and damning moral statements and policy changes without considering the marginalized as it is to treat the planet carelessly. If we're going to care for creation, all of creation and everyone in it, we need to consider the bigger picture. But where does it leave us? I know that, for me, it sometimes feels like we can't win for losing. How do we reconcile the pressing need to care for our planet and our God-given responsibility to do so, and the realities that we face living in it? The good news is, and there's always good news, that while we can't do everything, everyone can do something. Isn't it annoying when cliches turn out to be true? We know from the creation story that each of us is created in God's image. Each of us is called very good. Each of us is given the commission to be stewards of God's earth. Even if it looks different for each of us, we are capable of creating change. As Pope Francis encourages us, humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. Truly, much can be done. So I invite you to think and to pray about what it is you can do to honor creation in your life. Maybe it is using less plastic by not using plastic straws or bringing reusable bags to the supermarket, but it could also be holding businesses accountable for their destructive practices. Maybe it's becoming a one-car household, but it could also be supporting our national and state parks. There are many beautiful ones in this state. Maybe it's making sure that you vote for political candidates that make the environment a priority. But it could also be just sharing with the people in your life about what they can do to make the world a better place. Maybe it's going vegan, but it could also be buying locally sourced animal products and working to make healthy, ethical food available to people from all walks of life. And maybe it's a combination of all of these things. Ideally, that's what it will be. But one thing that all of us can do is change our attitude towards the world we live in. Someone in this congregation said it brilliantly during Pastor Margaret's sermon last week. Why we do what we do is as important as what we do. Let's remember why we have our sacred mission. Let's remember what is at stake. The doom and the gloom of climate change and pollution and extinction are important to keep in mind, but they're not the whole story. Learning to see God in creation and recognizing the beauty of this earth and our duty to protect it are what ultimately will spur us to action. My prayer is that we can go from this place and look at creation with fresh and open eyes, that we may see it again as the best and most precious gift, because that is what it is. The authors of the book Living the Questions included an anecdote from the poet Emily Dickinson that I just loved. She herself had a profound love of nature. It's a common theme in her poetry. She once said that "consider the lilies" was the only commandment that she ever obeyed. So consider the lilies. Consider the columbines, the bitterroots, and the Indian paintbrushes. Consider the mountains that surround us on every side and the big, beautiful Montana sky. Gotta tell you, I didn't know what the big sky meant until I moved here. Consider the swamps, the orange groves, the alligators, and even those huge Florida cockroaches. Consider the sun and the stars that God hung in place in the sky, and consider each member of our human family made in God's image. And above all, consider that we humans are not above creation, not lords of it, but part of it, and that we were born to care for the earth and one another. Amen.